two potential effects. One is that this leads to a downgrading of essentially impacts on South Africa's investment grade potential internationally as a consequence of this. But there isn't necessarily a direct impact from this grey listing, but it is not good because it basically adds to a general picture of discontent about the capability of South Africa and the capability of the government to essentially ensure that the economy and society are functional. So in terms of the impact on the man of the street, the biggest impact is from what is happening, what these indicators are reacting to. And really that's the big story rather than these indicators, is that we've got massive dissent. We effectively haven't recovered from the COVID crisis, in which 2 million people lost their jobs and there was a devastating socioeconomic impact. And we haven't really then addressed a lot of the critical components, structural components and supply side components of the economy that were destroyed during that period, such as our railway system, such as our road system, our bulk transport, our public transport systems, and our energy system and water systems. So all of those have now crumbled. And within that framework, we also have an assessment that we aren't able to deal with corruption in our financial transactions. And they're all related. And so essentially that's the picture we have to deal with rather than the sort of the rating itself. I would worry about correcting what the ratings are, what the various rating agencies and the FATF assessment have pointed to. That's the more important thing. And the question is whether or not we are addressing them. And if we don't, the man in the street is going to severely suffer over the next 18 months.
As it is, people are already struggling from a lack of a service delivery. We mentioned earlier on the finance minister projecting that the growth rate will be less than a percentage point. It was said that the grey listing will mean a higher cost of borrowing from the international markets. How does this all translate into South African, actually experiencing a capable state? Already, as I mentioned, there are many gaping holes in what we'd like. So is this simply going to worsen the situation, particularly if there is a flight of capital?
Well, I don't expect there to be a severe flight of capital. I think that a lot of people were expecting this FATF assessment. I think there's some possibility Moody's and various of the rating agencies won't necessarily downgrade us, but they won't upgrade us. So our position will sort of pretty much remain constant. South Africa, the government debt isn't predominantly foreign debt. And so it's really domestic lending that's important. So it's not entirely affected by these ratings. But what is important is whether government is in a position to now begin to turn this round. And I think that partly where these ratings are coming in is that people have kind of lost confidence in the governing party and government as it stands now to be able to address these systemic issues because they don't appear to be capable of making the hard decisions. And I'm not talking about hard decisions where you're looking at social trade-offs in society. It's about the hard decisions as to whether or not they're prepared to take on many of the corrupt vested interests that have captured parts of the state. And if those aren't dealt with, we cannot, no matter how much money we pump into it, we can't repair our infrastructure. There are too many interests with a hand in keeping our infrastructure destroyed. This has to turn around. And the question is really whether whether the current government is in a position to do that. I think that that's where a lot of people are uncertain at this point.
Fitch, for instance, saying a prolonged power crisis is obviously not going to bode well for South Africa. I mean, I don't think anybody really necessarily needs to tell us this, but we were speaking earlier on about the possibility of a cabinet reshuffle. How will that play out for international observers? Because we know that the markets, particularly the rand, reacts in some way or the other. So what would President Cyril Ramaphosa have to do to gain the confidence of the international markets with his cabinet reshuffle?
Well, if he showed some courage and, first of all, cut the cabinet and the hangers-on to the cabinet by about sort of 40%, and then only selected people who are capable and competent to be in the key positions, I think that would add to confidence in South Africa. But particularly because many of our state institutions at the moment are tied at the hip to the relevant member of the executive. This is a bad governance design we have in South Africa, and unfortunately we're going to have to live with it until we have more fundamental changes in the structure and architecture of our government, which we're not going to get in the next 6 months. But that means that whoever gets put in the executive of government has to be way more competent than the people that have been there up until this point. And if you start to look at something like Eskom and you see the interrelatedness of the various functions of government that lead to dysfunctionality, if we have dysfunctional investigative structures, prosecution structures in South Africa, it means that when people steal and destroy parts of Eskom and our other infrastructure and they get caught and we want to catch them, prosecute them, we can't. And so it continues. And what we've got is a sort of a whole series of government functions that are breaking down. So we need very, very good, honest people in charge of our security system, and we need very, very honest people in charge of our energy system and on infrastructure and infrastructure build, and we don't have them at the moment. And the question is whether we're going to get them from a reshuffle. There's certainly enough, we could save a lot of money if we streamlined the cabinet. And we would get rid of a lot of people who potentially and arguably are part of the corrupt networks that have been destroying South Africa. We need them out of government, not in government. And we're not seeing that. That's the first step at this point. And if he does that, perhaps he's going to regain some trust in his capability to leave. If he just pads cabinet and just adds more people and leaves a whole bunch of incompetent people in charge, I think people aren't going to have any confidence in this government. And we basically then are looking only at a change in government through an electoral process. But it will be very, very bad for South Africa if we have to sit with a government that nobody has confidence in for an extended period of time. That's just not the position we can afford at this point.